All right, we're getting started. Hi, I'm Maya. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Oblique. It's an identity and access management startup.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm currently a security engineer at Wealthsimple. So we're going to be talking about identity automation and a bunch of quirks in that space. But really, I'll talk about first, like, how did we get here? Why are we talking about identity at MacDevOps? Don't we just like manage laptops? So at my core, I've just been trying to provide a good experience on the Macs that are in my environment. I started out with 100 Macs. They were new. I think I had 3 weeks to figure out how to make it all work, provide a good experience. But inevitably, we just end up accidentally becoming the owners of other domains, of backing services that our Macs depend on. And it's certainly changed over the years, but it seems to happen all the time. And this can be about identity. It can be about all kinds of other backing services. Like when you have your Macs and Central IT runs the directory and there's 100,000 Windows devices and your 100 Macs. And you just kind of got to figure it out yourself. But you inevitably kind of become the expert of these domains that you didn't really intend to. And I've started to really think of this as the de facto hot potato, where you become more of an expert of service than those who officially own it are. But I think if we're conscious of it, like, you can definitely get burned by this, but if we're conscious of it, it can end up okay. But like, what am I really talking about? Now, a long time ago, some people that might be in this room seem to think that this was sort of a good idea of, we had our identities that were centralized, but we wanted to manage our Macs in the Apple way. So we set up the golden triangle. The internet said it was good. Others said it was good. But really, we had to learn this identity and directory structure. And it kind of became a nightmare, but you had to become really an expert in like Active Directory and in Open Directory and how it all merged together. And I think you just ended up sort of having to know more about all these things than just the Active Directory admin did. Now, Apple gave us this, but thankfully, Apple saved us from this pain. So we kind of got to step away from identity for a while. We stopped binding the Macs to Active Directory, Open Directory went away. But I think this lives on a little bit because that Open Directory schema certainly floats around in some Open LDAP servers that are run by companies that certainly have employees that are still in this room. Now, I definitely have hot potatoed some other things to myself over the years. I just wanted a couple Mac OS VMs to run auto package and use all that nice storage we had on our SAN, and like be able to test out our deployment infrastructure and such. But our ESXi was only 5.1, and I couldn't netboot on that. So I was told, go ahead and upgrade it. Well, that inevitably, what happened is I hot potatoed VMware to myself. And I had no idea what I was doing, but it never fell over at all. But thankfully, I think time kind of saved us from this. And the final nail in the coffin is probably like Broadcom licensing. They don't want you to buy this anymore. Then, you needed a bunch of, someone came to you and say, we need a bunch of physical Macs to run our CI infrastructure. But they want to be managed by our production configuration management system because it's all integrated. But that config management system doesn't support OS 10. So you go and yourself add support that's needed. And somehow you've had to figure out the Linux side and the Mac side. And now you are the expert of that domain again. Oops, you're now a production engineer. But maybe you were saved from this by EC2 Max or something of that sort. Now, more recently, I've had users that come in and say, hey, I can't connect to our resources over VPN. on Mac OS when I'm tethering. And what happens here is it works on Windows, but it doesn't quite work on Mac OS. So you become an expert in IPv6 translation mechanisms like 464xlat, and oops, now you own the VPN. I still own this one. But we got away from identity and owning identity for like 10 years. It was nice. But now we see things like web authentication for Platform SSO being announced. I've kind of avoided Platform SSO for a while. It wasn't worth it. Things like this, they're in the login flow on Mac OS. So I don't want to put things in line for people logging into their devices that aren't really worth it. They're not worth the squeeze. But now when I see the new changes to Platform SSO being announced, I start to think, hey, this might actually be worth it. This is something that I would want to have. There's benefits here. But this is, I think, a moment where we're going to end up hot potatoing identity to ourselves, because it's not straightforward, just like here's another SAML app, here's another OIDC app and an IDP that someone who's just day in and day out in Okta or whatever identity provider you're using can set up. You're going to have to really understand end to end what's going on with Platform SSO and all the backing components to make this work. If someone can't log into their Mac and you're responsible for the Macs, they're going to come to you. They're not going to go to the official owner of your identity provider, because that's what's backing it. So, yeah, I think we're probably going to own the IDP, but maybe it doesn't have to be so bad. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Okta, because it's the most common IDP that we've encountered in our environments. But maybe it just doesn't have to be so bad.
So I'm here to give the Okta 101 lesson for folks who don't know it. Okta is a lot of things. It's an IDP or SSO provider. It's an IGA, which is Identity Governance and Administration. It's PAM, it's ITSM, but let's just focus on the IDP today because that's what we really care about. So the components that matter for today's talk are Okta Single Sign-On, which connects with your apps to allow users to authenticate to them, or it's also what's used for connecting for Platform SSO, or with your HR system for pulling information about users and attributes in order to populate the universal directory. The universal directory is just a directory of users, but also of groups. If you want to give someone access to something in Okta, you can use an app assignment to let them log into that app. You might have to create the users in the app using user provisioning, and you can use group push or group link to push group membership to that app, like using SCIM. The more that you use Okta the way that it should be used, so with group rules and push groups and all that kind of stuff, the more you find what I'll call eccentricities in Okta and things you don't expect. So the best way to learn about Okta, in my opinion, is to learn how it doesn't work. I love puzzles, so I want to play what would Okta do? See if you guys can get it right. So we have a couple of puzzles we're going to go through today where Okta does something kind of insane, and maybe we learn something and see if you can figure out what happens. So first up, let's start with the riddle that inspired this talk. Okta has the concept of a group rule. If you want to create a group and you want everybody who's in engineering to be in that group, you first create a group that's called engineering. Then you create a group rule that says take everyone whose department is engineering and put them in the group engineering. You can also put them into other groups. Then you turn on the rule, important step, and hope that you didn't get the syntax wrong. If you got the syntax wrong, you can turn off the rule, fix it, and turn it on again, unless you got the group wrong, in which case you have to throw that out and start with a new rule. But in addition to adding people to a group called engineering using a group rule, you can also directly add them to the group. So the membership in your group can be a mix of people added dynamically and people that you've added directly. For example, maybe you have like a sales engineer you want to add to the engineering group. So let's pretend you have a group set up the way that you want. What if you want to remove people from that group? If we added Sam to the group manually and then removed him, what would happen? It works, makes sense. If we add Sam to the group using a group rule and then remove him, what would happen? What would Okta do? Does anyone want to take a guess? Stays in the group, stays in the group. That is incorrect. They actually do get removed from the group. They get removed from the group but they get added as an except. Oh, does that go here? No, it's not what I wanted. Yes, it is. They get removed to the group, and they get added as an exception to the group rule. And so any other place you use the same group rule, they also get removed from. Yes, that is very unintuitive. That's not even the punchline here. This is not even the thing of this that really confused me. So Okta also lets you see how a user was added to a group. So like I said earlier, if Sam has been added manually or via group rule, you can see how he was added to the group. And you can also convert how a user was added. And in fact, sometimes Okta converts this for you automatically. So if Sam was added via a group rule, I can go in and say, actually, I just want Sam to be manual. If Sam was added manually, and then I add a group that Sam is part of, Okta converts it for me silently and doesn't tell me. And so then, as we've just learned, if I then remove that group, Sam from that group rule, or if I remove that group rule from that app, Sam loses access, even though I never did anything that made me suggest that Sam was going to lose access to that app. So you get in these very confusing scenarios where it's like, who did what and where and when and what order they happen in. So basically, Okta has a canonical way of keeping data. Like whatever you did last is the canonical thing of how a user was added to something. And there are a lot of things in Okta like this that are implicit, which makes situations really hard to debug. And you need to remember how you did something in order to figure out what will happen when you do something else. Let's do another one. Suppose you have an app and you're trying to add users to the app and also give them specific roles in the app. It might have RBAC, so like for example, like Figma, you can create the users, but then you also can give them like the editor role or something like that. You need to have in Okta both app assignment to give users access to the app and group push to push them into the editor role. If you use the same group for both group push and for app assignment, what do you think is going to happen? What would Okta do? The same set of users, I want to take everybody who's on the design team, give them access to Figma, and also make them editors. No one wants to take a guess? That's right. Sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't. It will work most of the time, but sometimes it will fail. And the simple answer here is that basically Okta is a bunch of cron jobs in a trench coat. And once you realize that, you can understand why sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes one job wins and sometimes the other job wins. So sometimes the group push operation beats the app assignment operation. You create the user in Figma, but you've never actually given them access to Figma, so they can't do anything. Okta really does try to discourage you from doing this in docs, but everyone I've talked to just does it anyways. So, and then if it fails, they just hit the button that says run again.
So as we work through different ways of how Okta functions, and especially if we start thinking about platform SSO and kind of circular dependencies of authenticators, as well as we're trying to use platform SSO, get rid of passwords. Maybe we want sync passwords, maybe we don't. We just end up in this world where Okta supports totally different kinds of factors, and there's a lot of mechanisms that you can use within Okta to restrict which factors people might use, add additional ones, and whether that's enrollment, actual usage, etc. So I think that the question here is about what would Okta do, or what would Okta tell you to do to restrict the use of insecure factors, or whatever you may want to do here. So I guess it's a question, but I'm just going to go through this. So Okta has documentation about their new passkey management feature that lets you block WebAuthn or in general, or filter down the types of authenticators that can be used. But you might say your security team, you don't want people to use iCloud Keychain because or Apple passwords, because those passkeys can be shared with another user. They sync. I personally think we're trying to make things better. I would rather have that than them using passwords, but you're trying to mitigate risk. Maybe you're in some super compliant environment, but you can put in a bunch of policies there to restrict which factors can be used, but it's totally not clear to users why certain credentials might be blocked. Their browser will still pop up and say, hey, scan this code to enroll your factor. The Apple Passwords app will then show this credential, but then either it may not work or it may not work. It may not be usable because you allowed enrollment but not usage, or it might just not be there at all because you didn't allow enrollment in the first place, but it still shows up in the Apple Passwords app. So you go in and like you read some docs. You go to the Okta Support Center, and this is where things kind of become even a little more wild.
Yeah, Sam and I literally were having an argument about this like an hour ago. We were like, does it work this way or does it not work this way? Because the docs say that if you want to block WebAuthn, then you're also blocking anything Touch ID. And they actually recommend that you block passkeys altogether. Yeah, if this feature in their docs says that you block it, and that they changed this a couple days ago.
Yeah, so this is about passkey management. And there's no way for an admin to know if a user has enrolled a passkey. This is what the docs say, right? Yeah. It's right on top. This is not some document that was last updated 5 years ago. It clearly says Okta Identity Engine on the top here. So this is correct, right? But it's not correct at all because in the API, you can and you have been able to for quite some time be able to read the authenticators that people have enrolled, as well as see the AAGUID of WebAuthn enrollments, which lets you map back to different authenticators, like 5-second explainer on AAGUID. It lets you map back whether it's like to specific models of a YubiKey or a Phation key or iCloud keychain or some Samsung Knox passkey thing that exists on someone's phone. But like when someone creates a credential, when they scan the code, it lets you sort of see what that is going to be backed by. And you can create rules that filter upon these. But I think what's really important here is to know that kind of what I was talking about before about enrollment versus availability. If you are in the Okta admin UI and you end up in the authenticators page in the URL, it's like /enrollment. So if you just scroll down, you're like, oh, this is just about enrollment. That's all what these rules affect. But really those rules get merged in with your app sign-on policies. So you can have an app sign-on policy where it just says, hey, to sign into this app, it's one factor, it's WebAuthn, and that's it. But if you have an authenticator enrollment policy, which says a password's required and WebAuthn required, it's going to additionally require more things. So be conscious of this, but also like be super conscious of how users are going to use these flows for real. So
yeah,
the real world.
I think I have a couple more reasons, riddles for you. Have you ever synced data from your HR system to Okta or another IDP and caused a corp outage because you had like bad data? No? Okay. I've talked to enough people that have done this, and from like a reorg or maybe somebody renaming a team or things like that. And somebody called it a skimcident, and now I can't like unsee it. So if you're about to sync a bunch of data that mass removes access to Okta, what do you think Okta would do? All right. So they do have a feature that actually does prevent this, and it's called, they plan for exactly this scenario, and it's called import safeguards, but it doesn't work exactly like how you'd expect it to. Basically, if you were importing a sync that breaks user access, but specifically removes users from your identity provider or removes direct app assignments, it'll stop. It'll be like, oh, 20% of users are using access, stop it now, not go through. But if you're using group rules to assign people to things, like we just talked about earlier, so maybe I rename a team or I reorg a team or something like that, this feature does not work. And so you can still mass unassign apps from people. And I'm definitely trying to stare at people in the audience who I know have done this by accident. All right, another riddle for you. You probably have a mix of different types of users in your Okta tenant. Your employees and your contractors, your interns, all that kind of stuff. The user profile in Okta has a type, the field helpfully called user type, and this tells Okta what schema to use for the user profile. So you could have a different schema for employees and for interns, for example, and manage their access separately. What do you think Okta does with that field? I feel like people are scared to answer. Nothing is what I heard. That is correct. It does nothing with that field. The field just tells you what schema to use. You can't actually make a group based on that field. You can't create a group for only one user type. Those group rules are global and apply globally to all fields regardless. So Okta has this field, and it doesn't do anything. And it tells you, it's like, oh, we have this field, but it doesn't do anything. You'll have to create a separate custom field for exactly this scenario and use that where you put contractor information separately. Very annoying. And I have one last one for you. And this is actually probably one I hear a lot from this kind of crowd, are issues with Okta's API. So Okta has an API and it has a Terraform provider, and many IT admins have very reasonably tried to Terraform their Okta setup, especially to manage things like those finicky group rules that we talked about. Now, if you try to use the Okta provider, what do you think Okta does? I heard somebody say crashes. I heard somebody else say nothing. Crashes is probably closest to correct. Good luck. Okta, you're probably going to immediately hit a rate limit. They have pretty aggressive rate limits. You're looking at, most tenants will have about 500 QPM, not QPS, QPM. And Sam was pointing out to me, like 500 feels like a lot, but that includes all your read operations. And if you're dealing with like a large layoff or a large Terraform plan, like you're affected by this rate limit and are very throttled in what you can actually do. You don't have batch or bulk operations. So if you want to remove 500 users, that's 500 API calls. And it's worse because your API calls generally don't give you what you want. You need to make separate calls for each user to get their groups and their apps and their devices and all that kind of stuff. And you can't just buy a higher rate limit. That's not how this works. Again, remember that Okta is a bunch of cron jobs, and so too many of those running at the same time, they can't do that. The official Terraform provider actually has a field where you can set what % of your rate limit you want to use, knowing that this is a factor. So they've had to tell their users to engineer around them. And like, there's a field in here for like, would you like us to try exponential back off on our own API? And Okta has all kinds of other limits for you. Like you can have a maximum of 2,000 group rules. Group rules can be used to assign users to up to 100 groups. You can exclude a maximum of 100 users from a group rule. Like you have all these like weird edge cases that you don't hit, or these weird numbers and limits that you don't hit until you get there. And then you're like, why is this here? It's very strange. So really running through these quickly, like what are the takeaways from these? Some of the things that I'd expect to see in like an Okta design doc if I like could peek under the covers and see what's there. Any kind of relationship in Okta is unique. They don't have the concept of being able to do things multiple ways. So a user can only be added to a group one way. A group can only be pushed one way. The order of operation really matters since Okta is a bunch of cron jobs in a trench coat. Controls aren't all documented, as we talked about, like what is in the docs and what's in reality might not be the same, even if they're updated regularly. And so, pour one out for those docs writers also who have to keep writing those like known issues docs pages that they have. And the features don't necessarily work as you expect. The fields don't necessarily do what you want them to do. And like, good luck doing anything at scale. So to end on a slightly higher note, if you're stuck managing Okta and, what should you do? Think about the person who has to come after you, Sam, and make their job suck a little bit less.
Yeah, so like just 3 things that I think are super important to not burn yourself is experiment super heavily in a test environment. I think pretty much every Okta corporate tenant will have an Okta preview tenant. Super useful for testing, but also totally not the same as your production. They can behave very differently. So test in both. Set up specific app assignment groups per app. It is super common to say, hey, we're just going to assign, this app to all the employees and then all the contractors or something like that. But where this will really burn you is when you start to have Okta do provisioning, when you're dealing with SCIM. Sometimes SCIM errors out and it'll show up on the tasks page within Okta and you can retry it if provisioning failed for some reason. But sometimes Okta will just give up and it will not be transparent at all. It won't show up as an error. Provisioning just didn't happen. If you want that provisioning to be retried, pretty much the best way to do it is to remove that user from the assignment to that app, wait a minute, and reassign them, wait for the cron job to run. But if you've assigned that app to the employees group or the engineering group, removing them from that employees or engineering group is going to cause a lot of other problems of deprovisioning them from everything else that you've done for that. So do that. And lastly, the most important thing is learn to think like Okta. So the system log will give you a lot of very verbose information with nested JSON and all this stuff. But just if you just look at a system log entry of like, I'm trying to troubleshoot of why was someone not able to log in, or why was someone able to log in and I didn't expect it to be able to happen. You need to really be able to think about this, the structured data that you get there, how that merges with your app sign-up policies, your global session policy, and the few other things that go in there. But if you can think like Okta, then I think you can probably be successful. So yeah, I think those are like the 3 big points. But if we're able to do all that, I think we can really get to, a world where we're aware of the quirks. We've, instead of hot potatoing Okta to ourselves, we've hot bageled Okta to ourselves, and we're able to live with it. This is something that probably isn't going to be saved from us by the likes of Broadcom or something like that. Identity is around for a long time, and if we're investing in something like Platform SSO, that's the kind of thing that's going to be around for 5-10 years, and we need to be able to support it and know what's happening instead of just here's a black box of how someone logs into your computer. But if we can provide a great authentication experience coupled with our great Mac OS experience, like, we can do right by our users and sleep at night, because we don't have an ESXi cluster with the storage backed by layer 2 networking that's doing a round trip around the San Francisco Bay. So maybe some other system is that we depend on, but at least we're not responsible for it. And I think that's it.